trial transcript and of secondary source books and of histories of the Sacco and Vanzetti case goes on to tens of thousands of pages of unbelievable detail and analysis, and a lot of it has to do with legal stuff. You know, did the bullet come from this gun? Did the bullet come from that gun? Did they switch the gun while it was in evidence? You know, did the gatekeeper pull down the gate from the railroad? But all this incredibly arcane stuff, which is really important, and we couldn't possibly include in the film. The script of this movie, which runs, you know, feature length, I think it's probably 30 pages of double-spaced text. Any book about the Sacco and Vanzetti case, including Felix Frankfurter's and a lot of other fabulous books about the case, are hundreds upon hundreds of pages. When I first started the film, I met with the guy in Boston who has been collecting Sacco and Vanzetti lore since the beginning of time, and he knows more about the case than anyone in the world. And he said, I will only work with you and be interviewed in your film if you agree to make the film 20 hours long. And I said, but Bob, I can't make the film. No one can sit that long. Movies are as long as the human bladder can hold out. And then I went and I must have had breakfast with this guy 3 or 4 times in Boston during a week I spent there. The second meeting, he was like, 12 hours? And I said, no. And I've worked with Ken Burns, so I know how to make 19-hour-long films. This was not a film that wanted to be 19 hours long, and so a lot of the details aren't in here. And there's some details that I felt that might have said, Sacco did it, Vanzetti didn't do it. A lot of stuff where instead of going into, yes, this is why people think this, but it's not really true because of that, I think our choice was, we can't do that. That's not the point of this film. The point of the film is to tell you what we think is true, based on evidence, and to take you on a human journey through this story. And if you want to learn more, please read books.
The structure, did you arrive at that in some collaborative way? I mean, there's biographical information, and then there's the crime, and then there's the trial. I would say that those would really be the 3 parts. Was that an organizing principle that was difficult to arrive at, or was it, you know, a no-brainer, or?
Well, it's sort of a story that has to be told in a linear fashion, so that's.
There's a 4th element, which is the art, in a way, and the art being sort of just a stand-in for the meaning of it all, right? So we've got the trial and the people and the crime, and then you've got the public outcry and the public interest in all of this. And one of the things we tried to do from the very beginning of the film, and this was a struggle in editing, was to weave in artwork and music and movies.
And their letters.
And the letters. But, you know, how did the public engage with this? From Ben Shahn to Woody Guthrie to Ed Giobi, who you see at his canvas, to Edna St. Vincent Millay, to all these people who made art about this. And our goal was, in the very first scene, we've got Henry Fonda delivering a speech from the movie The Male Animal, in which a professor recites a quote from Vanzetti to his English class and nearly gets fired during a kind of Red Scare moment. I mean, how the world viewed this is really the framing device that a lot of this film is about.
In the back.
You mentioned Erastus Corning. Is this the same Erastus Corning?
Did I say Erastus Corning?
There was mention, I recall that as well. There was mention of an Erastus Corning, and it kind of made my ears perk up. He was longest serving mayor in American history.
Jesse mentioned him.
Okay, I'm having a senior moment. I was just hearing about Rastus Corning when we arrived in Albany today, and we were very excited to learn all about him. But
there was mention in the film. I recall that as well. There was. Yeah.
I think you got the special Albany edition of Sacco and Vanzetti, which.
Yeah.
Carlos Goodridge. Oh. Well, okay, there was Rastus Corning. Okay, we were talking about all of the various eyewitnesses whose testimony was discredited. And if one of them was named Erastus Corning, and he went on to become the longest-serving mayor in Albany, we need to know. So someone Google this and tell us, please.
We actually have the biographer of Rastus Corning in the audience. So.
Yes.
A year too early.
A year too early.
So somebody else with a name a whole lot like Erastus Corning's name.
Wow.
Wow.
Also unreliable.
Alternative fact.
Yeah.
Yes.
So the scene where you were talking about their 7 years they spent in prison, the images shown were very somber and sad, but then as soon as it went to the decision that they were going to be executed, the music, I believe they were reading Vanzetti's letter directly after that scene, and the music became kind of almost happy and calm. Was that to show that maybe Vanzetti was okay with the whole I'm going to be executed? Was that piece of all of it?
There's a moment after once it's decided they're going to be executed, when Sacco reads a letter to his son, right? And he says, "Dear son, instead of crying, please think about nature, and here's how you can console yourself." And so it is, in some ways, the father writing to his son, who at the time was 13. I think he went to prison, his son was 7. And he says, "Dear son, instead of mourning, please enjoy the beauty of nature." And we learned early in the film that Sacco was very connected to the earth and to wandering looking for the rose, and he was a guy who loved being outside. So, yeah, do you remember what the music choice was there?
I think that might have been some of the original music, but I'm not.
We worked
Not
with a
positive.
classical guitar player named John La Barbera, who is a scholar of Italian folk and classical music. And a lot of the music in the film are traditional songs that would have been played in Italy at the time that Sacco and Vanzetti were around. And it's a good point, which next time I watch this, I'll pay attention to that. There's also some Respighi, various classical composers represented in the soundtrack.
How important is the soundtrack? What's...
Well, I think that gives it sort of the heartbeat, I guess. You can make a film, and usually when I edit, I score it with existing film scores, and just to kind of see how it's going to work with music, because otherwise it feels very dry, and sometimes it almost feels like cheating, to use the music, but we try not to make the music too manipulative, but it does add an extra layer of emotion.
So Amy, are you thinking about music when you're editing, or are you? I mean, is that always on your mind, or?
It kind of depends on the project, but sometimes I work with pieces where I'm cutting to the music. So, like the film we did on Doc POMUS, that was all about a songwriter. So, I was choosing songs that sort of mirrored the circumstances of his own life. And so in that case, the music was almost dictated where the cuts were, and I sort of built the scenes around certain lines in the songs and stuff like that. This is more underscoring, and it wasn't really scored to picture, so I was just editing the music that they recorded kind of wild and sort of laying it in there. So.
Yes.
I know this is a frivolous question, but I'm just curious. The footage you have is of them always wearing suits. And I was wondering, and even at the end, but what did they wear in jail? They didn't dress like that in jail.
That's a great question. I think that when they went out when they had their picture taken, it wasn't when they were in prison or jail. It was when they were going out to a hearing or an appeal or a trial. That's when your photograph taken, is when you're between the jail and the courthouse. So what were they wearing in jail? I don't actually know the answer to that question. The only photos we ever see of them, they're wearing suits. And, nice hats sometimes, too. It's not a frivolous, that's a great question, actually.
There's an iconography. Maybe is it because of the limited imagery available? I mean, that those few images become almost holy, or.
One of my favorite pictures of Sacco and Vanzetti is of the two of them sitting side by side with suits on, looking at the camera, and I think Vanzetti's a little leaned over to the side, and it's just this absolutely stunning portrait of the two men together. And when they were out in the world before the crime that they were accused of happened, they weren't actually even close friends. They lived in different towns. They were part of the same anarchist circle, but they barely knew, they barely spent time together. They knew each other. Here they are together, and you look at them, and they're these two striking-looking men. But if you look down at the very bottom of the photograph, their hands are handcuffed together. And we spend time in the film looking at their faces, and but if you tilt your camera down, in fact, they're being photographed in the context of a legal proceeding where they are still being cuffed.
And even though they didn't know each other, they were cremated after they died, and they took their ashes and they mixed them together, and then they buried half in Tor Maggiore and half in Puglia, where each of them were from. And that's actually, my father loved this film, and my stepmother passed away before he did, but they decided to do that too. So I didn't tell you that. But
I never knew that.
Yeah. So,
Holy smoke.
we did that.
Yeah.
Did you want to say something?
No.
Did you find that you needed to also resist the hagiography to some extent? I mean, these were, clearly victims of a miscarriage of justice. On the other hand, they were people who did believe in the violent overthrow of government. Is there anything complex about that, or is it?
Everything is complex about that, which is why it's so interesting. To me, these are two men who I really admire. We grew to really feel like they were in the editing room with us, and they're part of our lives. They're very extraordinary human beings. They also were violent revolutionary anarchists who are members of the most extreme faction of literally bomb-throwing anarchists who are out there. The people who gave the stereotype of the bomb-throwing anarchist. Their faction was trying to blow up the Attorney General in 1919. These guys were not innocents. However, they were being tried for a crime that had nothing to do with their anarchism. They were being tried for a robbery at a shoe factory and a murder that had nothing to do with so they were tried, in a sense, for being anarchists. And they're absolutely guilty of being anarchists. But they shouldn't have been tried for being anarchists. They should have been tried for a shoe factory robbery, which almost all the evidence that I've seen says they almost certainly didn't do. Yes? What's the next project is the question. Amy and I just finished a film about the classical conductor Robert Shaw, called Robert Shaw, Man of Many Voices, about the great choral conductor that's just starting film festivals right now. Just won the documentary prize at the Beaufort International Film Festival a couple days ago. So look out for that. We finished a film called Projections of America, which is a story of a World War II propaganda film unit in America that made movies to explain America to newly liberated overseas populations, to explain who we were, that is now being shown on PBS stations. And I've been working for the last few years, and Amy's just started to do some editing on a movie about the palliative care movement in medicine.
You're not both working on the Automat movie, right?
The Automat movie, there's a movie being made about the Automat that I've been consulting on. You're not moving.
No.
The Automat, the Horn and Hardart Automat, do you know what that? Where you could get your food in a little drawer? Mm-hmm. It's actually, that film is being made. How do you know about this film? That's great. You're a good researcher.
It's my job to research you.
That film's being made by somebody who used to run a film festival that showed our film A.K.A. Doc POMUS and showed Jews in baseball and liked our movies so much that she called me up and said, I'm making my first film, help. So I helped.
Yes.
America has 250-year history of immigrant groups, racial groups, religious groups, political groups, and we, in those situations, we move to the right. We're in one of those circumstances right now. I'm interested, as a historian, whether or not you see a theme that moved America back to the middle after each one of those demonizing episodes.
Can I turn that question around and ask the historian? What do you think? Yeah, I'm asking you. I'm just a filmmaker.
I'm not a historian. I'm for Paul and a few others. I'm a biochemist at Tiger. And I've been for a long time. But for the last 10 years, I've gotten deeply interested in American history.
Do you have any compelling theories?
Pardon me?
Do you have any theories?
I think it's circumstantial myself, but I want to clear what this gentleman.
My sense is, since you asked, that we keep dealing with unspeakable injustice in this country. There are a couple of, we massacred the original inhabitants of this land. We enslaved tens of millions of human beings, kidnapped them, murdered them, and dragged them into bondage for hundreds of years. We also welcomed immigrants into our country and provided opportunities for people who were fleeing from danger and terror and war and famine overseas, and provided a home for people like my ancestors who came from Eastern Europe fleeing oppression of Jews around the turn of the 20th century. That's good. Once we got here, people treated us terribly, right? There was bigotry, Italians fleeing poverty and oppression where they come from, come to America, and they're treated like second-class citizens. And it gets better, as they say, right? So we figure out, we have a civil rights movement that takes 100 years to finally get equal rights for African Americans. We have immigrant groups that come here and are reviled at first and then become assimilated and become part of the mainstream. That's, I think, a really good process, but it goes in terrible fits and starts. And then we end up in a situation like right now where billionaires reach out to working class people who are frustrated and say, hate people who don't look like you, and that way you'll be happy, while we rob you and steal from you and don't provide you any real answers. And unfortunately, a lot of people go along with that because they're frustrated. It's a mess, but I just have faith that this American experiment can work if we open our brains and open our hearts to realizing that our diversity is our greatest strength, and the rule of law and fairness and decency is what we do well, and ignorance and bigotry is what we do badly, and we should really try to stop.
Maybe 3 more questions. I believe I've neglected this side of the room. Is there anyone? Yes.
There was one part that stuck out to me. I think it was maybe 40 minutes in. It was when you guys were panning over the prison and the architecture and that scene. And it said that prison is a terrible university. I think was a quote. Was that a quote, or was that something that was just put in there to really capture that meaning or that metaphor?
That was Vanzetti in one of his letters from prison to one of his. Vanzetti wrote constantly in prison, and his English, he started off speaking very little English, and by 7 years into his prison stay had become quite eloquent. And some of the things that he wrote are so poetic. And prison is a terrible university is actually, Prison is a Terrible University is the filmmaker from Italy, Montaldo, citing what Vanzetti had said. So it may have gone through a translation process, and then we translate it back with subtitles. So there's a poetry in what Vanzetti said. There's a poetry in how this filmmaker from Italy who made a film about Sacco and Vanzetti translates those words back. But I love that line.
Amy, were there images that you wanted to feature in the film that just couldn't fit?
I don't think so, but there were a few scenes that just didn't seem to fit in there, like when you went to visit Mrs. Gavoni. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah. So one day we're filming in the neighborhood where in Plymouth, Massachusetts, where Vanzetti lived. And remember, we meet the old man who says, "I remember Vanzetti in the neighborhood with boots on." Mm-hmm. And there's still the neighborhood, Swassos Lane, where Vanzetti lived. We went there with our cameras to film, and lo and behold, Link Robbins, the old guy with the green cap who takes us on touring around, says, "You know what? In my research, I remember there's an old lady named Mrs. Gavoni who lived over there in that house there." And we're like, "Really?" So we're rolling our camera and we follow him in, and he knocks on the door and goes, "Yoo-hoo, Mrs. Gavoni!" And lo and behold, Mrs. Gavoni, Vanzetti's neighbor, who is still alive 1,000 years old, opens the door and welcomes us in and says, "Yeah, I remember Vanzetti." It was so cool that I said, "This is the best thing that's ever happened to me as a documentary filmmaker. I found Vanzetti's neighbor." And I gave that footage to Amy, who said, "It's really good. It's really cool that you got it. It does not serve the story in any way, and we can't fit it into the film."
Yeah. Yes, that's right. And we still get along. Every film there's like a scene like that. Where, yeah. But I was kind of sad it didn't make it in, because every time we heard Link Robbins go, "Bam, bam, bam, Mrs. Gavoni," my cats would just scatter. And so they had to like live through me listening to this many times before.
What was? I mean, it reminds me of the adage to fiction writers to kill your darlings, and
yes.
And so what was the problem with that scene?
It just didn't really flow in the story. It just was like a third arm or something, and yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I was fascinated with the interviews with the daughter of the deceased paymaster, because those are the other victims in this story. Was she at all reluctant to participate, or how did it happen?
The question is about the daughter of the paymaster, Jeanette Parmenter, whose father was killed, and was she reluctant to speak? By the time she was in her 90s and we caught up with her, she was finally willing to speak, but she had been reluctant up until then. She had given one newspaper interview maybe 15 years before that and really didn't talk to anyone about it and tried to live a normal life, but she had a terrible life. Her father was murdered. Her mother was diagnosed with cancer soon after and died a couple of years later. She was orphaned and got brought up by, I believe it was an aunt who was not happy to have her around. She had a very tough childhood as a result of, really tough, of these circumstances. And she is really a victim of this story. And when I asked her, "Do you have any idea, how do you feel about Sacco and Vanzetti?" It's not, she doesn't care about them. She cares about the life she led, which was really challenged by her father being killed. And I asked, as you can hear on camera, "Do you think they killed your father?" And she says, "Well, somebody did." She never received justice because the people who were punished for the murder of her father were not the people who should have been punished. It was unbelievable that we were able to find her, and it happened by complete coincidence. It happens that somebody that was also in the film, the young historian Marianne Trasiati, had gone to college with a person who lived across the street from her. This was not how you do research, but it worked. But then the thing that really struck me was towards the end of the movie, we have a moment where she talks about being in college and she's taking a class, and the teacher assigns her a poem by Edna St. Vincent Millay about the Sacco and Vanzetti case. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, it's just really intense. You know, this case clearly haunted her entire life, and she's a very dignified and together person, but who had this black cloud that followed her around.